All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jim Schoonmaker. I'm Vice President of Programming of the Cornell Club of Washington. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our co-presidents, Annalise Schoonmaker and Justin Conrad. Our speaker tonight, and you can see him there, is David Muchow, whose name you might recognize because almost exactly 5 years ago, he presented a program for us entitled How to Start Your Own Company, which was very well received. So he's back tonight, and he'll be sharing some insights from his new book, The 7 Secret Keys to Startup Success. Provides a practical business and legal information to take startups and growing companies step by step through what they need to do and never to do to be successful. And you probably noticed if you saw our online post that he was just interviewed online by Cornell. And that link is on that post if you'd like to, if you haven't already read that, it's helpful to take a look at that as well. So Dave's background is he's managing partner of Muchow Law, he's a 30-year business expert, serial entrepreneur, corporate lawyer, and inventor who's advised hundreds of businesses, teaches law, business, and entrepreneurship at the School of Foreign Service. He has helped turn ideas into publicly traded companies and was an officer of a $1 billion publicly traded mutual fund. Earlier, he served on Capitol Hill, of course, a lot of you probably have as well, with the NSC, OMB, and as a prosecutor and special assistant to the head of the criminal division, the U.S. DOJ. He was general counsel of American Gas Association and a founder and CEO of Skybuilt Power, which built the world's first rapidly deployable solar wind power stations for the CIA. Can't tell you anything more about that. We have a lot to cover tonight, so please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them as time permits. We have one housekeeping note. You probably saw the first 3 folks who registered for tonight and are attending tonight receive a free copy of David's book, and we'll be in touch with you directly about that. So with that, Dave, it is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. Can you all hear me okay?
Well, they can't
Yes.
speak, but
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, so nice to be here. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for all the good work that you do for the Cornell Club, because it's, an awful lot of work to handle all the programs that you run all the time. And at the same time, your daughter's getting married. So, so thanks again for all the good work that you do. Have you ever wondered why some companies just fail and others succeed? We're going to talk about that tonight, and along the way, hopefully have a little bit of fun. I'd like to keep this very informal, and I really hope that as you get a question, feel free to put it on the chat box off to the side of the screen, and I'll be happy to stop at any time and to field your questions. Let me give you a sense of what we'll be talking about a little bit. I'm going to share my screen here and a quick outline. We'll be looking at why startups, 8 out of 10 of them fail in the first year, along with other growing businesses, which fail all the time. And I'll explain the big disconnect between the information that's out there and what people really need to succeed. We'll talk about 7 keys to startup success. Why do the companies fail and what should they do to succeed? And some smarter management practices. And then at the policy level, how we can create a better national approach to helping to jumpstart entrepreneurship in this country and not just have it a bunch of, unrelated silos and unrelated resources that make it so hard to start companies. The problem is that 8 out of 10 startups fail, and the jungle could really get you. There are, let me play that again. It's very difficult to go from a concept to commercialization, and along the way, it's pretty much like you're walking through the jungle blindfolded in the middle of the night, and snakes and animals and everything are dropping on you and making it really, really hard for you to succeed, and you could end up as somebody's dinner out there and be swallowed by either lack of finances or bad management or whatever, 1,000 different things. The reason why I wrote this book, The 7 Secret Keys to Startup Success, started out as my experience with working with hundreds of companies over the years and seeing that the questions that they were asking me didn't have answers, except if you called a lawyer and spent $500 an hour or something to get those answers. Most of the books in the startup field tend to deal with 1 or 2 subjects like management or finance and marketing. And the questions that I was getting were much more practical. How can I start a company? Do I want an LLC or a C Corp? Should I incorporate in Delaware? How can I fire my employees and not be sued? Very practical things. In addition to the lack of kind of practical information, both legal and business, because usually most startup books don't even get into many of the legal issues that are so important, and they're totally intermixed, particularly as a startup. The other reason why I thought this book could be useful was because at the macro level, we are losing thousands of would-be companies, some of whom probably shouldn't ever succeed because of a bad product or management or whatever, but many, many, many of them, perhaps thousands of them, could. And we're losing thousands of Apple or Microsofts every year. And if you look at the economic impact at the macro level of that, it's probably over $1 trillion. How do I get to a crazy number like that? Well, just take Apple. Apple supports around 2.7 million jobs. They have a market cap of over $2 trillion. And they put $100 billion a year into the economy every year. And what if you had 1,000 companies like that? And so many of them are being lost. So this, I think, is a pretty important thing to take a look at, not just at the micro level of an individual entrepreneur growing business and how to succeed, but at the national economic level. So the book is kind of a rich dad, poor dad for startups. It's very practical. It walks through the 7 secret keys to startup success. And I call them secret, not because they're locked in a box somewhere, but because people just don't know about them or don't usually hear about them until their lawyer tells them they just made a bad mistake or violated an SEC rule or never should have done that with an employee, for example. In a lot of jurisdictions, you can't run a criminal background check on an employee without getting a written consent on the front end. So there are many, many things like that in each of the major 7 areas of operations of a company that need to be addressed. And these are the areas that we'll be touching on that are in the book. Planning is obviously very important. Risk management, which is not generally discussed in startup books, but is so important. The more I've been involved with companies, the more I realize that understanding the risks and what could go wrong is just as important as knowing what to do right. We're going to talk about how do you protect your intellectual property, because as a startup at the beginning, that's pretty much all you have. You have an idea. And if that gets stolen by somebody else, then you're back to ground zero again. Personnel management, really a tough thing. Raising money and managing personnel are, in my experience, the toughest parts of running any kind of a business. Marketing and sales, and then what I call management zen, which is you're drinking out of a fire hose as a CEO of a startup or a growing company, and you've got everything coming at you. You got finance and lawyers, you got to build a product, and you got to market, sale, and so forth. And maybe you've still got a part-time job and you're doing this in the evenings. It is not easy. And how do you do all that but not destroy your family life and keep some kind of balance? So those are some of the things we'll be discussing. And let's kind of take a few of these first in a little more detail. Let me go back to the prior slide, and let's just talk about some of these specifics, and then we'll go into why people are failing when they're trying to do these things. In terms of business planning, as you may recall, Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And I have worked with companies that had no plan, went out and really knocked it out of the ballpark, but there are very, very few of those. Most companies don't start out and they don't know what their product is or who their customers are. All they have is a hypothesis. They think they know that, and so they tend to run down the wrong road without talking to 100 people to find out what the customer really might want. I've worked with companies that I came in and advised them. They thought they had a product. They ended up in, no, it's not a product. It's really a service, or it's just software. And when you're planning, you can think about a lot of different things. One is, how much of this business do I really want to be involved in? Let's say you have a new widget and it's going to save the world. You don't have to build it, develop it, market it, manufacture it, design it, and so forth. You could, for example, just capture the intellectual property on it, license that out, and sit under your yacht, and if it's successful, and clip coupons, get your royalties. So planning is really important. Let me give you, let me switch back for a second to my desk here and give you a visual example of what happens when you don't plan. Now, when I first learned how to snow ski, which I guess is a requirement for going to Cornell anyway, what the instructor took us all up to the bunny slope. And the first thing I told us was not what to do. I told us what not to do so you don't break your leg, right? You never put your skis parallel pointing downhill or else, right? And all of us have been there, done that. So as a startup or a growing business, you don't know a lot of what you need to know. And this is kind of what happens. This is my little skier here. He's already lost one of his ski poles in a terrible accident because he didn't know what he was doing. And we will put him on this ramp and see what happens. That's the kind of thing that can happen if you don't know about moguls and you don't know about some of the important things that can keep you out of trouble. So back to the shared screen here. Risk management. There are so many different risks, and often people forget about them. I tend to think of risks as sort of like my friend here, Mr. Risky, my friendly dinosaur. And even while you're doing everything you have to do in a business, you have to continually be aware of the risks that you're not thinking about. I was running a company, we were doing a lot of government contracting, and all of a sudden there was the sequester. If all of the budget in the federal government freezes for a while, you're not going to be selling a lot of products. There are black swan risks, there are risks you can kind of figure out, but there is always a risk out there, and you need to kind of understand what it is. So make sure that every now and then you stop and think about, what is it that I'm not thinking about when I'm trying to design my product or service and sell it? And how can I protect myself? And then you need to continually do this. This is not a one-step operation, or else you're going to end up being hit by some risk that you should have thought about way in advance. One of the biggest risks is that you fail to continually raise enough money. And on the financial side, the big risk is if you don't have enough money and all you're doing is worrying about money, you're not going to be able to do anything else, and you'll be making terrible decisions in your company. Another big risk is what happens with intellectual property. And what is intellectual property? It's anything of commercial value that you have that you want to protect. And as you may recall, there are various kinds of intellectual property. You've got trade secrets where you don't have to file anything with the government. You just keep it a secret. If it ever gets out, of course, then you've lost it. And the classic of that is Coca-Cola, which supposedly has a recipe, and I've seen some pictures of what it supposedly was and is. It's just got 5 or 6 ingredients scratched down on a piece of paper, but it is now protected in the big vault at Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, and supposedly, according to legend, only 2 or 3 people know the combination, and they're never allowed to fly in the same airplane together. Coke has really milked that secret. It certainly could be deconstructed, but it is part of the myth. And having intellectual property does a bunch of things for you. It can create a monopoly for you and keep everybody else from doing what you are doing or having the same kind of product or service. But it also encourages investors to invest in you, because if you have an idea and you're trying to commercialize it and there's no barrier to entry for anybody else, the investor's not going to be quite as excited about your product or service. Let me just maybe stop there for a second and see if anybody has a question so far they might want to throw out, or anything that they might be thinking about.
We don't have anything yet in the chat here.
Okay. Well, if you do, feel free to chat away, and I'll enjoy handling those for you. Personnel management. This is a really tough one. There are so many rules about what you can say and not say when you're hiring people, firing people, and so forth. Some of the key things you want to keep in mind are: make sure you understand local law, not just federal law like EEOC, but local law, as to what kind of questions you're allowed to ask of prospective employees. And if you're going to fire somebody, make sure you have an extremely good track record to show bad performance. So it's not just a matter of he said, she said in terms of someone's performance. You want that documented. You want to have routine personnel reviews. You want that in writing. You want milestones that are specific so that you can make sure that you won't be sued when you fire someone. Back to the intellectual property side, just to add a few more things to that. One of the challenges people have is trying to figure out, when should I patent something? Patents are expensive. It depends on the complexity of the invention and the number of claims you're going to have, and of course, which lawyer you hire. That's a lot to do with the price. One of the things you can do to reduce legal fees, which is a really important part of keeping your costs down as a startup or a newer company, is I like to work with small to medium-sized firms, or if I work with a large firm, that same firm with 1,000 partners may have a partner in the middle of the country that's only charging half to 2/3 of the price of their partner in New York. And so you can really save some money by where your lawyer is and what size firm they're in. Of course, the bigger the firm, the more overheads they have. I think of it as a little bit like if you have a headache, you can fly to Minnesota and go to a Mayo Clinic and spend a lot of money, or you can take a couple of aspirin. And if you know what problems can be solved without having to use a lawyer, you certainly want to know some of that. And in the intellectual property area, you can file a copyright fairly easily online with very low fee. I describe how to do that in the 7 Secret Keys. A trademark is a little more complicated. A trademark is a mark that protects your service or product from the same name being used by other people. It's a kind of monopoly, basically. And that gets a little more complicated because there are thousands of categories that you will need to select from to decide what kind of coverage you want in a trademark. A copyright is much simpler, so you can do that online, and you can copyright music or artwork or obviously written material of any kind. And it's very difficult to patent software for lots of different reasons, but sometimes one of the less expensive ways to protect your software product is to copyright it, which costs a heck of a lot less and would not necessarily even involve a lawyer, just a simple filing, but can give you quite a bit of protection when your software is printed out into a solid printed form. So when you're dealing with intellectual property, don't think about it as something separate from your business plan. It should be an integral part of it. You can't afford to patent probably all of the ideas that you might have. And so what I suggest to my clients is once you get your invention or idea pretty much established in your mind, maybe 80% of it is there, and it's some of your core value and core technology and secret sauce. That's when you'd start thinking about speaking to a lawyer and talking about whether or not it makes sense to patent it and how much it would cost and so forth. Typically, the first step to a patent process is not to file a patent, but to do a patent search. Why do you do that? Because you don't want to spend your money patenting something that's already been invented. And there are patent search agents, and they are not attorneys typically, but they're really good at searching existing inventions. And then you come back and you take a look at what that search would reveal, and you do a 3-column sheet of paper. Column 1 is here's my invention, here's what I'd like to patent. And the middle column is here's what's already out there, so I really can't get that patent. And then you go through that screen and end up with column 3, which is here's what now I might be able to get a patent on. A relatively simple patent with maybe 10 claims and so forth, you're talking $7,000 to $12,000. So it's not something that you want to rush in and do without really checking to see what else has already been invented. And once you see what else has been invented, it will give you ideas about how to make your invention better. And one of your goals here should be to create a patent minefield. What do I mean by that? You play this war game with the competition in your mind, and you say, okay, here's my invention. Now, what is my competition going to do to try and get around that? And then what am I going to do to prevent that? And then what are they going to do to get around that? And so you create this concentric group of concentric circles around your core ideas that you want to patent. And it makes it a heck of a lot harder for people to get through it. The shaking the money tree and raising money is another pretty tough thing to do. It's one of the hardest things to do. I've spent a lot of time raising money, and I've created companies that have gone up to $1 billion, but it is very, very tough to do. Even Thomas Edison spent most of his life dealing with 1, lawyers on intellectual property challenges, and number 2, trying to raise money all the time, because he had some failures along the way with like rock crushing machines that ended up, the rocks actually crushed his machines, didn't work. And so you continually need to think about raising money while you're doing everything else. You need a runway of 12 to 18 months, ideally. That's darn near impossible, but it would be great because then you can make good business decisions, not just made on the basis of, well, I've only got, $150. So here's how I'm going to have to spend that money. You also need to be very careful in raising money. Make sure you talk to an attorney before you start the process. Every state has what are called blue sky laws, which require you to register. And there are exceptions to this, and lots of them, which is why you deal with a lawyer on the front end. But every state has rules that require people who are going to try to raise money in their state to register. There are exceptions to that if it's a small amount of money and so forth. But what you don't want to do is to break one of those laws on the front end thinking that, well, my grandmother lives in California. She's going to put $10,000 into my company. I guess I can just take the money. No, don't do that. Because if you do that and you make a mistake, the next person who is anywhere reasonably sophisticated doing due diligence on your company is going to say, you don't even know how to raise money. I'm not going to give you any money. You've already broken the law. Now, I'm not going to go into the details on that, but my main point is talk to a lawyer. And when you're putting together your company on the business planning side, I would think about looking honestly at your strengths and weaknesses as a manager. Everybody's got a strong suit. And that's probably why you might be a CEO or an entrepreneur, because you really know quite a bit about something and you're darn good at it. But think about the guy who is a really great drummer in an orchestra. And now overnight, he's the orchestra leader. So you've got to understand what you know and don't know. And you really need to be very humble about that. And make sure that you put together a management team and maybe a board of directors as well, which is always optional, who can fill in those gaps. So in thinking about your management team, if you're really great at software, make sure that you on your management team, either on the team as an employee or as an outside independent contractor, that you have a good savvy lawyer who's been down this road a lot, that you have a good CFO type, not just a bookkeeper, because if you're going to be raising money, you need to know quite a bit more than a bookkeeper knows, and where the money is as well. And think about somebody on the technical side, if you're not the technical person who really understands the product or service, and then put a couple of people on your management team or on your board of directors who can open the doors to your would-be customers. Because again, you really don't know what your product or service is as much as you think you do. It's just a hypothesis, and you don't know who your customers are. So you go out and you do market research and you talk to 100 people. And I'm not saying that casually. Talk to 100 people. And when you talk to them and you do market research, you don't try to sell your product. You ask very open-ended questions. Like, so who's supplying you the same kind of product that we're talking about? What do you like? What do you not like? What's the price point? How could it be better? Hey, I have an idea. We're thinking about doing this. Does this have any wings? You think it's going to work, or do you have a better idea? If you do that 100 times, you are so much more likely to succeed than if you did it 20 times and you went down the wrong path and spent all your money on something nobody wants. And I see this all the time. I see people so eager, they'll build a prototype and they'll run out and sign contracts with a manufacturer or a developer, and they'll blow $100,000 on a product that absolutely nobody wants. I've done that myself. I learned that lesson. I love to invent things. I've invented a lot of stuff. It's great stuff. It may be the best in the field, but it's also very possible that nobody wants it. So make sure that you really do some very good market research. Marketing and sales. There are a couple of things really to keep in mind that you don't want to make a mistake about here. You can read books on marketing and sales. They're all kind. And I was a door-to-door salesman full of brush at one point. One of the, on my first day on the job, my boss said, hey, there's an apartment house over there, and it has a sign that says no solicitors. So he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a grocery bag. We're going to slip your quick sales kit into that and put an inflatable head of lettuce on top and walk right in. And that sounded like it might work until the first door that I knocked on was the super for the building, who blew the whistle and threw me out. So there's door-to-door marketing, which still works. many of you who own a house, there's probably always somebody coming by wanting to pave your driveway, right? But obviously, social marketing is so much more efficient, and you can reach so many more people. But one of the things to look out for, and I'm a former prosecutor and handle cases like this, is don't make any claims that you do not have a factual basis for, or you will be in violation of federal and state advertising laws. The main one that the FTC enforces is called the Lanham Act. And when I was in the natural gas industry and we wanted to slow some of the oil jobber folks down in a head-to-head competition, some of the oil jobbers who were selling oil into the New England area, where gas was kind of sweeping the field back many years ago, were making outrageous claims, and we just got them shut down by showing that their claims were not factual. So your competition will eat you alive if you make a non-factual claim, and the government will come after you. So be very, very careful when you're making marketing claims to at least have some footnotes in your files and so forth that will back them up. Let me stop there for a minute, see if anybody has a thought or question.
Yes, back on raising money, Derek Colbert said, can you speak about the different strategies that you used or would recommend regarding raising money?
Yeah. Every investor, well, first, you need to figure out with a very good 3 to 5 year profit and loss statement in your business planning process. How much money do I really need, and what period of time do I need it? And think about how long it's going to take to raise it, right? So start out with what's your goal. You do not necessarily want to raise more money than you want. Why is that? Because the people giving you money are then going to take a bigger share of your equity. And think about it. Larger companies with lots of money want to give you enough money to move the needle and make sure that you succeed, right? So they may try to put much more money in your direction than you want to accept, because that means you're giving away a lot more equity. And there are lots of different kinds of money. And money is not just money. There's good money. What do I mean by good money? Good money is money that gets you something more than just money. It gets you a joint venture with a manufacturer who will cut your costs. It gets you a customer who will distribute and market your product. It gets you something more than money. But then there's spiderweb money. What's spiderweb money? Well, spiderweb money is money from somebody who is using you as their criminal laundry machine. And they're just running money through your business because nobody would ever easily find out how they're laundering the money. And startups are one of the great places for criminal elements to put their money. It happens all the time. So you need to be careful of that. Then there's what I call fishhook money. Fishhook money is money where you go for the worm and you get caught with the hook. And what does that mean? Well, that means that you're taking the money from an investor, but the investor says, okay, I got you now. Here are your performance metrics. You better hit these numbers on profit and gross sales by these time periods, or I'm putting my whole team in there. And incidentally, since I already put maybe 75% of your equity in my pocket, now I own your company and you're out. So that is a very bad situation to be in. So when you're raising money, think about how much money you're going to need, as I said, over some period of time. Let's say you start out with 150,000 and you figure a couple of years from now, you're going to need to raise 300 to 500 and then maybe $1 million a couple of years later. You want to make sure that you don't give away so much equity that you're a minority partner and everybody else owns this company. If you're the CEO, that is very distressing when you wake up to find that out. So how to raise money? One of the first things you can do, and don't just think you're going on Shark Tank. there's a lot more to Shark Tank than meets the eye behind the scenes. It is very, very difficult. And usually what you would do is start very simply. And if you don't have your product or service made yet, and you're really starting out, go to some would-be customers, get them to create a letter that would say something like, hey, I would agree to buy X number of these units at Y price if it performs the way you say it's going to perform. Haven't even built anything yet, but you need traction. And if you don't have the product and you don't have any sales, at least have some indication that there could be traction or sales out there, right? The other thing you can do is to file a patent. And patents make pretty big impression on sophisticated investors because they don't want to put money into something where somebody else can roll right over, put more money in, and then you're just left on the side of the curve. So think about meeting with an intellectual property lawyer fairly early on if you have an invention. You don't have to have an invention to sell a product or to make money. It doesn't have to be patentable, but it certainly helps. Those are just a few tips. And happy to handle a follow-up question if you wanted to delve into that in any more detail.
We don't have anything else at the moment. Let's move on to the your next point, and then we'll see. We kind of have some, at the end. We can kind of throw some things out.
Okay, so let me talk about some of the things you can do to succeed, generally speaking. And let me flip down to the next slide here. And one of the things that I might just mention, let me just get back to here are things never to do again, a couple more. We've already talked about a business plan and a budget. Write things down. Let me give you a classic example. CEO says to an employee, the employee says, hey, I've been working my tail off for you for a year. You haven't paid me much. The CEO makes a big mistake. Says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And the CEO forgets that. The employee doesn't forget that. And 3 years later, knock on the door. It's an attorney for the former employee. The attorney says, you promised that employee that you would take care of the employee. That employee's work represented 30% of the value of this company. Your company has gross sales at 10 million. We want $3 million. And I can tell you, as a lawyer who does a lot of litigation and practices, this stuff happens all the time. So don't make wild promises. If you are going to suggest something, write it down with enough caveats and have your lawyer look at it. It might say something like, look, I can't afford to pay anything now. As you know, our sales are not sufficient, but I'd be willing to take another look at this, but no promises once we make our first sale. That's okay, but just be careful. The flip side is, or the same sort of thing, is so many people start out a business with their friends who they played basketball with or know socially or whatever. And it turns out that somebody's really good at basketball or your high school buddy, but knows absolutely nothing about finance or marketing. And what you want to do when you're creating your team is you want people who are qualified. So don't just start with people you know and like. Create a position description on the front end and then make sure that they at least check most of the boxes on that so you don't end up having to destroy a friendship. Generally speaking, stay away from, co-presidencies and co-management and where nobody can make a decision. And put your partnership arrangement in writing. I call it partnership. It can be a corporation. Put it in writing. You need to know under what conditions can each of you be fired by the company. You need to know exactly who's going to be paid what for doing what, over what period of time. If you don't put that in writing, what happens is one partner is, this is really one of the biggest areas where 8 out of 10 companies fail. One partner is going to feel like, well, I didn't know that I had to do all this work, or I thought I was going to be paid more, or my understanding was once we got to this point, we were going to readjust our equity shares. You got to get that stuff in writing. It's a prenup, and you spend more time with your partner as a startup than you do with your significant other. You need a prenup, and that's a partnership agreement. Couple of things that you have to do or not do. Remember, your knowledge as a CEO is like Swiss cheese. Just because you're really good at something, do not assume that you're good at everything. You're not. And so make sure when you build your team, you have some marketing talent. If you're not into marketing, you have a personnel person who knows how to handle people. Because maybe you're a hard driving person and you don't like personnel issues and you tend to like to forget them. That's where lawyers start coming into the picture and saying, well, you said something nasty about my client and you violated an EEOC rule, on and on and on. Make sure that you understand what you know how to do and what you need help with, and build your team that way. Be humble and listen. The best executives I know are humble. They don't try to show how smart they are all the time, even though they may be the smartest person in the room. They listen. They got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and make sure you listen. Thomas Edison always gave great examples of that. He would walk around every day, talk to hundreds of employees if he could, and he would say, "Hey, how you doing, Joe? Have you, I know you're working on this filament for the light bulb, and I know you've tried this brand of bamboo from India, but have you tried one down in Cuba? Why don't you go down to Cuba, give that a shot?" He was so plugged in and so humble that everybody was willing to really give them more than the 60 to 80% that any employer has the right to ask for. They were giving them 90 to 100% of their effort, and sometimes more. We talked about needing a professional team. We talked about lengthening the dollar runway as long as possible. So your business decisions are based on business matters, not just, hey, I'm out of money, so I got to do something crazy here. When you're doing your budget and your P&L, be conservative. Investors like to see very lean companies. You've heard of the lean startup, where you make a prototype that's super simple and you don't get locked into something before you know that there may not be the right product or service. And figure a 20% contingency, because you can't figure all the things that are going to go wrong. And believe me, they all will. So be very conservative in your budget, and investors like that, because then they figure you're not just blowing their money on an expense account or something. You are living very lean. There'll be time to be better compensated later on if you're successful. We talked about putting it in writing. And finally, managing lawyers' legal fees. Lawyers are expensive. They can save you a heck of a lot of money. But when you don't have a lot of money as a startup, it's a major factor. And you can plead poverty with lawyers as one way to save money. You say, look, I've just got a startup here. What can you do to help me on a fee arrangement? Can we defer the payments? Have you got a junior associate that can do some of the routine stuff? Stay away from partners as much as possible. They are much more expensive. Make sure that you have the lowest category and lowest fee number of attorney working on your project at all times. And don't let new lawyers come in, because the law firm might be wanting to groom the client, as they say in the legal business, to expose them to more and more work by other lawyers in the firm. Finally, let me just mention something about the format of the book. I've written some some other legal books. They are not beach reads. They are, some have thousands of footnotes. So, one is 7 volumes. And so when I wrote this book, I thought, well, why can't a business book be fun to read, for Pete's sake? And so I've tried to make it very conversational throughout. It's got a lot of footnotes still, and it's got charts and things you don't find in any other startups books and model forms and everything else. But to make it fun, think of an Oreo cookie, right? The crunchy stuff on the outside, but this wonderful cream filling that you can't wait to get into. And so what I did was create a fictional character called Scooter Magee. My son's nickname used to be Scooter, and Scooter travels around. He's a Georgetown professor, travels around in his old Austin Healey convertible, like I used to have, and he fixes broken startups. And along the way, Scooter, like Harrison Ford in Raiders of the Lost Ark, who was a professor, but then ran into all sorts of crazy stuff. Scooter gets caught up with the CIA and a enticing fashion heiress from Latin America. And Scooter hangs out at the Tombs restaurant in Georgetown, which, if you've been there, is a very interesting place. What's even more interesting, if you ever go down there, you always turn left to go into the restaurant at the bottom of the stairs. But suppose you turned right and went and looked at what used to be or looks like a solid wall. What might really be behind that? So after every serious chapter on marketing and finance and risk management stuff we've been talking about, there's an adventure story about Scooter Magee, but it contains an example of real life stuff that I've actually run into in my career of working with a whole bunch of companies. So I'll stop there. Let's see, 7:52. Jim, I'll throw it back to you if you had some questions or whatever. And I have some other things I could say too. But
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so much information that you presented in this event, as well as the one 5 years ago. And, we hear about people like, people who started Apple or Microsoft or, a car company that's all electric. But a lot of people, obviously it took a lot of work to get there. What do you say to people that do have a desire to do it? I mean, what's your recommendation if they really want to do it? What advice do you, I mean, just off what do you have to kind of say to yourself? What kind of person do you need to be to do that, I guess is my question.
The kind of person that you need to be is one who knows that they have a lot to learn. So, obviously buy the book, but aside from that, have a lot to learn and need to create a good team and need to do some good planning and the other things that I discussed. It takes belief in yourself. It takes incredible persistence. This is very tough stuff. You're starting out in a field where you have a 20% chance of success. On the other hand, you could be extremely successful. I will tell you that there's no such thing as failure, and you need that approach. You need to put mustard on failure and eat it alive. If you're going to succeed, you need to have an attitude that you can win. But you also need to have an attitude that I'm not going to keep knocking my head against the wall at some point. I'm going to put on an investor hat and say, hey, does this thing just not have any legs? And pivot and stop and try something else. So those are some of the characteristics. One other characteristic is I mentioned the chaos of everything coming at you as a startup with no staff. It's very hard. Let me give you an example. I was in Japan at the airport some years ago, and there was a big crowd around, and I had no idea what was going on. And a guy was selling this toy, which I bought, and it is a classic example of chaos. And my wife can only take so much of that. But that's what you're dealing with. So you can do it. Step back, put a good team together, get yourself a plan, and no matter what happens, you're going to learn an awful lot. I mean, so many startups fail, but with the lessons learned, so many times the entrepreneur learns those lessons that come pretty tough, won't do it again, and has a much greater chance of succeeding. So if you're interested in doing it, and if you want to talk about it at all, feel free to contact me. My name and contact information is on the slides. And I'll be happy to chat with you at any time.
Yeah, it's also, I refer back to the post on our website. Your email address is on there. So so you people can write to you, I suppose, and then directly.
In the 3 minutes I've got left, let me just suggest one thing at the macro level, the policy level, which is so important. To bake a cake, you need three things. You need the ingredients. They all need to be in one place, and you need an oven. We don't have that among startups. A typical startup is a guy with a day job, hasn't got time to figure out how to do a government grant, has never done one before. He's got to hire a lawyer, finance, develop a product, and all that. What we really need to do is we need to take Cornell Tech and every other major research, big university around the country. And we need to get everybody together in one place. Everything is siloed now in the startup business because the lawyers are here, the money is here, the products are here. And if everybody were in there, you walk in on day one, you have an idea. That idea goes before a board of experts. They go up or down. If they go up, you can use everything in this facility. They will finance it. You will get volunteer former CEOs, accountants, lawyers, patent people, corporate people. In this same place will be the IBMs of the world looking to buy new inventions. There will be the big investment companies with tons of money. Deals will be cut around the water fountain. The prototype will be made in the basement. And what does this get you? It gets you from an idea to commercialization in 90 days. We can do this, people. We can go to the moon, for Pete's sake. We can do this. And we are losing $1 trillion, more than that, because we're not doing this at the federal level. And we're making everybody have to figure out how to be a Thomas Edison. And there aren't that many Thomas Edisons around, quite frankly. So what I've suggested is that at the federal level, with some state and private sector money, we treat it like a venture capital firm, where this thing can be self-funding, like a self-looking ice cream cone. And the last slide shows how this is going to work. And, basically, we can do this. Everybody will end up better off. The investors will make more money. There'll be more sales. The entrepreneurs will be more successful quicker. And 8 out of 10 of them won't die. So that's my final shot. I think it's really something that should be taken a look at by the Cornell Techs of the world, by the business schools, at Cornell and the other entrepreneurship operations.
So, Dave, we really appreciate you taking the time to do this tonight. It's, I think, for those that have attended have stayed with us here because they obviously are interested in the information that you're presenting, and I think perhaps are very interested in starting a business, and that's great. But I put your email address in the chat there for those that wanted to see it right away, and appreciate the fact that you will be able to respond to that. For those that joined us late, we did have that little teaser about the first 3 people who sign up and attend will get one of your books, and we will follow through with that. We identified those 3 individuals tonight, and you'll be hearing directly from us. Just a plug going for the club here. Continue to keep an eye on our website, cornellclub.dc.org. We've got more events coming up. There's still been a discussion with the pandemic, coming out of pandemic. We're still continuing to do some things like this one virtual. Others we're doing in person. in some cases, the venue allows it for it to be a larger air room or partially outside, such as if you attended, Zink's night, you would have seen that as an example of that. So we're continuing to try to experiment with different formats to accommodate people. And when we do things in person, we're also trying to do things not just in DC, but in Virginia and in Maryland as well. So I want to thank you all for taking the time tonight, and I hope you have a great evening and a great Thanksgiving. And see you at the next one.
Okay, thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.